Welcome back to another episode of Learning Vue.js the hard way. And what I mean with the hard way is that we are learning Vue.js in this series by reading through the documentation, so by reading through the official Vue.js guide. So if you've been following along with this series this far, I'm glad to have you along. Thanks a ton for watching all the previous videos. Now, we've talked about a lot of stuff, but what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about template syntax. By the way, before we get started, let me also just mention that sort of the idea of this series is that I will sort of try to explain as much as possible with my voice so that you don't have to keep your eyes glued to the screen at all times. And so you can hopefully multitask and do something else at the same time. Well, of course, at some points you have to dig in and actually look at the code, so put your eyes back into the screen. But anyways, let's get into it. So we're gonna talk about template syntax. Now, we've talked a bit about the template syntax before, right? Remember the sort of mustache thing. And actually, let me just open up our files here, right? So I'm in this folder that we've been working with before, where we have an index.html file and a main.js file, and it's the same stuff that we've had before. So let me open up Vim and let me open up the index file in and let me open up the index file so we can have a look at that. Sorry, let me just turn off wrapping like that. Sorry. So what I wanted to find was okay, actually, sorry, we didn't use any any of these mustache things here, but you can see we're using the directive vbind and we're using the directive v4. And what I meant is, of course, that you can have these. Let's say if you have a span element here, like let's say you have a p element, then you can say bind. Like you can do this mustache syntax and then put the name of some variable. So like I don't know, like name, maybe that's, or like let's say first name or something like that. Like maybe we have a variable called first name. So we've looked at this sort of extensively in the previous videos, but we're gonna look at it a bit more in detail now, and we're going to be introduced to some more concepts, right? If you look at the table of content for this section of template syntax, you can see that we have interpolations, directives, and shorthands. And let me just read the sort of subsections of these. So for interpolations, we have text, raw HTML, attributes, and using JavaScript expressions. And we've touched upon these, but we haven't really talked about these in details. And then we have directives. And subsections for that are arguments and modifiers. And then we have shorthands, and subsections for that are vbind shorthand and von shorthand. Let's I guess we just dive into it. I think, if I'm not misunderstanding, it seems that interpolations are essentially this sort of mustache syntax, and directives are these things such as vbind or v4, things that you add to attributes, right? Dynamic attributes. Let's think of them that way. Like you have an HTML element, and then you can add a dynamic, or you can bind an attribute to some kind of value. So sort of view-based attributes, HTML attributes, which I guess is sort of like I was going to say in Angular, but maybe it's actually called directives in Angular as well, right? Correct me if I'm wrong here, but yeah, and then maybe we should think about directives sort of as on the attribute level, and we can think about interpolations on the element level, right? It's like interpolations are replacing the contents of an HTML element, which means interpolations are essentially replacing HTML elements, whole HTML elements, or like a collection of HTML elements, but directives are replacing attributes, some attribute in a given HTML element. Sort of like, not metaphorically, but I mean like loosely. I think this is probably accurate, but we'll see if this is like completely accurate. And then the shorthand section will essentially just describe some shorthand syntax that we can use, so we don't always have to say v-4 or v-bind, because that probably gets cumbersome if you're building a whole Vue.js app. Like if you're just, one of the things that Vue.js is sort of promoting is that there's sort of, what do they call it? Progressive? I think progressive, not incremental. I think they're calling it progressive, right? In that you can take your existing application and then sort of sprinkle a bit of Vue.js on top of it, or like add a bit of Vue.js sort of bit by bit, right? So you don't have to sort of rewrite your whole application in Vue.js. And so what I wanted to say is that if you do that, then maybe it might make sense to have like if you don't if you sprinkle Vue.js, right? If you just add pieces of Vue.js, then it might make sense to actually use the sort of v-for, v-bind sort of syntax. But if you're writing your whole application in Vue.js, then it's like, well, it's implicit that the whole thing is in Vue.js, so you'll be sort of familiar, or like the reader of your code will be expecting Vue stuff. So then you don't necessarily have to be sort of explicit and say v-for, and then you can use the shorthand syntax. But we'll get into that. Okay, now I'm sort of jumping ahead. Let's look at interpolations. I think probably in this video we'll just look at interpolations. And then in the next one we'll get to directives. So wait, how do I close that? Okay, so template syntax. Okay, and I mean there's no point in me sort of reading this introductory section, because it's essentially just explaining what the sort of template syntax is, and this we know, right? We know that we can define templates. So this that we have here, this HTML that we have here, is a template inside of the app, right? It's like it's some regular HTML, but with some Vue stuff inside of it. And then you will take your data model and you will pass that, or you will run your data model through your template. Maybe that doesn't really make any sense. It's probably more like you take your template and you run that through some function that turns that into a function that accepts the data, and then you pass the data and then you get something out. But I mean, this is not, it's not even like that, because you're also sort of binding, right? So it's like you have a template that when given some data will be rendered, but then Vue.js will watch for changes in any of the, or like will observe changes in your data model and update the view accordingly based on your template. I think I'm probably just making it worse. If you watched the previous videos, you know what the template is, right? Okay, so and yeah, I mean they're just maybe saying a bit more detailed things, right? Like, I mean, this is similar to React. It's like Vue takes the template and constructs a virtual DOM, document object model, which is essentially, I mean, my understanding of this is that it's just an in-memory representation of the document object model. So the HTML that is eventually rendered to the screen. So Vue.js keeps its own copy of the DOM because they can optimize that DOM for whatever operations they need to perform on it. And then, I mean, React does sort of diffing between DOMs, I believe. Maybe I'm wrong. No, sorry, they do yeah, okay, it's better if I don't go there, okay? But I mean, I'm just emphasizing that the use cases for the virtual DOM might be slightly different for Vue.js than from React, but maybe not. I mean, in some sense, it's also like, as they were saying here, right? Like, Vue is able to intelligently figure out the minimal number of components to re-render and apply the minimal amount of DOM manipulations when the app state changes. So what that means is that since they have this virtual DOM, they can say, okay, I now have this virtual DOM, but you have this actual DOM that sort of is the visual representation that you have on screen. So you have like a bunch of elements. Let's actually maybe let's do this. Let's open up this page that we've built, right? So we have something more concrete to talk about, and let me just make the font size bigger here, right? So we've had this sort of shopping cart kind of thing where it's like you have a list of cart items, and then like this text box where you can add a cart item, which actually, I mean, this is a really stupid example. It makes no sense. I probably should have just done a to-do list like everyone else on this one. Made perfect sense. But anyways, the point is that the data model, like, let's look at the data model. Let's open the main.js. You can see in our data model, we have this array of fruits. And when I click add here with the text orange, that orange is added to the list of fruits. And what was I going to say? Yeah, okay. So what happens, presumably, is that of course, first a lot of other things happen. But when you add that orange is added to the data model, and then somehow it ends up in this virtual DOM through this watching, right? It's like we're adding. I mean, what do we do, right? We're calling, so we define the method add fruit, and add fruit takes, yeah, sorry. So actually what happens is that, yeah, okay, I made this overly complicated, but like when I write orange and press add, this, wait, sorry, okay, so the text field is two-way bound to the data property, or to the data model property fruit. And then when I click add, we're taking this two-way bound property, we're taking this property fruit, and we're pushing that into the list of fruit. So when it's pushed into the list of fruit, so the array fruits, then that will cause this this piece of the template that if we then jump back to, yeah, I guess let's jump back here, right, to the HTML, you can see that we are then saying v4 fruit and fruits. So then somehow Vue knows that this, the cart item element is going to be rendered once, I mean, like, because we've said syntactically, it knows that it's going to be rendered once per fruit in the array fruits. But somehow then it figures out that, okay, but if you render this list item once per fruit, then that means that if the list of fruit changes, then this thing needs to be updated, because it needs to be updated whenever the fruits property changes. So, and yes, somehow then, like, there's an update in the virtual DOM, so they compute what like what in memory they compute what would happen to the page somehow, or what would happen to the DOM if you actually made this change, and then they take that virtual DOM and then they say, okay, but what do you have displayed on screen currently, and how can we, with a minimal set of changes, move to what you have displayed on screen currently? I mean, I haven't dug into the depths of Vue, which is why I'm kind of struggling to explain this, which you can probably feel, right? Because I'm not actually exactly grasping the concepts, but I'm not actually grasping the flow, maybe is a more sensible way of thinking about it. But we have these different pieces, right? And I think you can sort of get a feel for what the different pieces do, right? I mean, it's like we have the actual DOM, which is not in any sense related to Vue. But then we have the virtual DOM, which is Vue's representation of the DOM in memory that they have control over. And then they sort of take that virtual DOM and they make sure that your actual DOM matches that, and they try to optimize that, the amount of or the computation that goes into the matching, right? The computation that goes into turning your actual DOM into what it should look like. So the number of like add element like calls, right? Like the number of sort of plain JavaScript calls that they make to update your HTML, because like if you're altering like 100 items at the same time, it might be slow, and like if you're updating 1,000 items at the same time, well, it's like, well, maybe you have an issue here, and then they try to of course do that as optimally as possible. Okay, but so that's like we have the DOM, we have the virtual DOM, but then we also have like our data model, which is like the virtual DOM, I guess, then should sort of always be updated to reflect what's in the data model plus the template description, right? Or like the template description given some data model. And yeah, then we have these other parts, like we have the I'm trying to remember what I called this before, right? But like we have maybe I called it the model data before, because we have the model function. Sorry for forgetting this. Ooh, that's a bit silly. If you remember, I mean, if we jump over to the main.js file, you can see we have the methods. Oops, we have the methods here. So yeah, I mean, we have, and then these are the hooks, right? But what I wanted to emphasize is if I move this methods up here instead, we have data and we have methods. So it's like, did I call it method model? That makes no sense. I mean, we have the model data and the model methods. Whatever, let's just think about it that way, right? It's like the methods that are associated with this particular component. That probably makes a lot more sense. We should think about it that way. It's like we have the data model, and then we have some methods associated with this component that can be used to compute things on the basis of our current state in the data model, for example. Okay, I'm totally falling off track. Let's get back to the template discussion. I don't know why I went down this rabbit hole, but okay, right, because we were talking about the minimal amount of DOM manipulations when the state changes. So, and yeah, this is actually pretty cool. Wait, JSX. So they're also saying, if you're familiar with virtual DOM concepts and prefer the raw power of JavaScript, you can also directly write render functions instead of templates with optional JSX support. So JSX is actually, let me just Google that quickly. I mean, this is a React. I'm just trying to figure out if that's like originally something which has to do with React, or whether that's something that was sort of used by React. So JSX, now we're on Wikipedia. Yeah, but we're on the React page, right? So I would guess that JSX was introduced by React, which means that maybe if we're talking about the virtual DOM here, maybe that's actually sort of the same libraries that are used in React. Maybe, maybe not, right? I mean, it makes sense to not rewrite, to not reinvent the wheel if the sort of React open source people have already done a great job of figuring out some of these, let's say, applying the minimal DOM manipulations problems. Yeah, then it would make no sense to reinvent that wheel. But I don't know. Maybe we'll see in the future. If you happen to know that, whether these are sort of whether Vue is sort of based on some of the same core libraries that React is based on, do shoot something in the comments. That would be interesting to know. Anyways, let's dive into this. So this hopefully sort of makes sense. This is maybe an important point, right? They're just saying that all Vue.js templates are valid HTML that can be parsed by spec-compliant browsers and HTML parsers. So that means that you can, even if your HTML, even if you wouldn't run your templates through Vue, so even if JavaScript would be blocked, for example, your HTML can still be rendered by the browser. Now, you wouldn't get all your reactivity and you wouldn't get access to your model data. Like none of the Vue stuff would happen, right? But it's not like the browsers would freak out and be unable to display your application because you've used all of these strange directives like v-on, like, right? Like the browser could go, what is this crazy stuff? This is not HTML, but actually it's valid HTML. Right? So you're allowed in HTML, if I go back to index.html, you're allowed to define this arbitrary attribute called v-model. I mean, it's legal, it's syntactically legal, right? It's just semantically meaningless if you don't have something that reacts to that, right? If you don't have for example, then JavaScript that behaves or acts upon this particular attribute. Anyways, let's drop that, right? So that's pretty cool. You can rest assured that your HTML is compliant. I guess what that also means is that you could actively make sure that the initial state of your template is looks like something that would be an acceptable render if you happen to provide the web page to a user that for some reason has disabled JavaScript, or like for some reason is at the moment unable to load JavaScript, right? Like let's say the network goes down, which makes no sense because like why would you get the HTML but you would not get the JavaScript? But maybe like for offline applications or like something like that. Yeah, that makes no sense. But sorry, wait. but something like that, right? Like you can either way. It makes even let's say maybe the JavaScript takes a long time to load, right? Then maybe you have other problems like you need minification or like you need to reduce the weight of your JavaScript and all that stuff. But beyond that, it might make sense because maybe your HTML is not huge. Then it might make sense to design your HTML such that when the user initially gets your HTML, it will look acceptable, right? Like you get the HTML, you get the CSS, your page looks fine, but it just looks like it's loading, right? Or looks like, maybe like looks like either it's loading or it's saying you don't have JavaScript, right? But yeah, that makes no sense. I don't know. Let's think about that some other time. It could be both of the cases, right? You could initialize it to make it loading, but you could also maybe like load some tiny JavaScript that would. Sorry, now I'm going a bit off topic, but it's like you could provide your HTML, and in that HTML, the default case is sort of like everything just like looks like you've disabled JavaScript, but then there's a message to the user saying something like you're using a non-compliant browser or a non-supported browser, I should say, or you could say something like this page requires JavaScript in order to work properly, for example. So please enable JavaScript. But then you can load this tiny JavaScript file that just updates all of these texts with loading screens, right, or like loading spinners or whatever. So then immediately they get a loading spinner, and then you load the big JavaScript file. I'm just talking about the order in which things happen on the page, like the order in which sort of here we load the main JS file, but before that we maybe load the sort of loading.js file that sort of updates everything and says now everything is loaded. But yeah, so like, yeah, so load.js would mount into the components in one way, and main.js would mount into, or like, sorry, mount into your DOM. I can't remember the terminology that's used here, but mount into some particular L, right? Mount into some particular element. That's actually, yeah, I think that's actually a pretty sensible idea. Maybe we'll do that. Yeah, I mean, in the intention is that I'll try to finish up this series by doing something with Vue and Firebase together. Maybe I'll have to do some series on Firebase first, like maybe something like the hard way guide, or like and Firebase the hard way. But we'll see. Maybe not. But anyways, maybe that's the thing we'll probably do in that finishing up video. Okay, now I really need to move on. Okay. So that's sort of the introduction, and then there's this interpolation section. Okay, and I think we're understanding this correctly when I say interpolations, in that I was saying that it's replacing elements. But maybe the more appropriate way to think about it is that interpolations, hence why they are called interpolations, right? Interpolations interpolate strings. And so if you think about the syntax of HTML can, so the contents of an HTML element, right, between an opening and a closing tag can either be a new element, or like a single element, a series of elements, or some mixing of strings and elements. I think like in the XML spec, in the XML specification, it's called like mixed content or something like this. So it's like you can mix, you can intermingle or intertwine text, or like strings, and HTML elements, which makes it a bit trickier to parse HTML. But I mean, that's a totally different question. So actually, that's the way we should think about interpolations. Interpolations interpolate mixed content in some sense, right? Kind of like that. I think maybe that's an oversimplification, but it's like between two elements, between two tags, inside an element. So here in their example, they have this span tag, right? Like span, and then a message, and then some mustache syntax, and then an end span tag. And in this mustache tag, they're specifying MSG, which then refers to a variable called MSG. So they assume that in the data model there will be a property called MSG. And then this mixed content, this string inside of the span element, will be, when rendered, will be replaced, or like will be interpolated, right? So this is a string that will be interpolated, where this portion, the mustache portion, will be replaced by what the contents are of this, or by the contents of this MSG variable in the data model. And again, reactively, right? So it's updated when the value of that thing changes. Okay. And yeah, that's what they're saying here as well. And then, wait, sorry. Apologies. Okay. Then here's an interesting thing, right? Then they're saying that there's also this directive called v_once. And if you use that, then you're ensuring that the element is no longer reactive. So I think let's actually try that out. Let's look at our page again. How can we try that? If we say, okay, like this, right? If I refresh the page and we have orange in the text box and I click add, then you can see like we're step by step adding oranges. Actually, sorry, let me put the input text and the button above the list rather than below, so I can keep pressing without having to move the mouse. Sorry, that makes me sound very lazy. But let's just check again. This still works, right? We're just adding a bunch of items. Let me do this instead. So what if we said that this cart item? No, let's do this. Whoops. Let's say that the UL tag, the UL element that wraps the cart item, like the every cart item, let's add v_once to that. Will that work? We'll say, let's render this UL only once. And then I'll refresh. Okay, we get the first, but what if I press orange now? Yeah, then we don't get it. Okay, so let me duplicate this list. And then let's remove the v_once directive on the second one. Let's see what we get. So now we have two lists, and if I add an orange, we're adding it to the second list, but we're not adding it to the first list, right? So once is saying that whatever is inside of this element should only be rendered once. Let's try one more thing. Let's try. What if we manually add a single list element to the top that contains the, let's say, vbind, and we're vbinding to, no, sorry, I don't mean to vbind, I mean to do this. We use the mustache syntax to interpolate in the fruit value, like this, li, whoops, li. So let me just see, yeah, so then we get orange, and then let's do that for the other list as well. So now both of the lists start with orange. And of course, if I then change, yeah, if I, no, wait, yes, right. If I change the text here, right, like let's go uppercase, orange, you can see the lower list has uppercase orange, the upper list just has orange, right? It's just the old lowercase orange text. So what that means is that if you specify v once on an element, then that thing will only be rendered once. That, like, it will not be reactive to changes. It will not observe changes in your data model. And that, of course, means that everything inside of this element will also only be rendered once, because the whole thing is rendered once, and it's sort of hierarchical, right? So if the container is only rendered once, then the things inside of the container can't be rendered like multiple times, can't be sort of updated, but rather everything inside is only rendered upon the initial rendering. And I think they specify that here as well when saying that, yeah, keep in mind this will also affect any other bindings on the same node. So I assume that's what they mean, right? So I assume when they say node, they mean sort of that element, like node in a graph, not in a graph, sorry, in a tree it has to be, right? I mean, of course, yeah, an HTML document will have to be a tree. So that node in the tree will only be rendered once, but then all children of that node can only be rendered once. I think that's accurate, right? I mean, I might be mistaken, but I really think that's accurate. Let's try maybe, yeah, I mean, it wouldn't matter if I, like, why would it matter if I added, let's say, like a span tag here or something like that? Like, no, of course that wouldn't matter, yeah? So, I mean, still not reactive, right? But maybe if we do this, like if I remove the first list now and we say something like this, let's say there's a div element where we say v1s on that div, and then we just print fruit, right? I'm just trying to think, just to ensure that it's nothing special with let's go instead of div, let's go to a p tag. I'm just trying to make sure that there's nothing special about using using just a list, right? No, but you can see it's not updating, right? But if I remove the once directive, then of course it's updating, right? It's actually changing. So that's pretty cool. Like you can render something only a single time. I can't actually think of a scenario of like why we would want to do this, but if you have a good idea of when this might be useful, please do shoot something in the comments. That'd be interesting to read. But yeah, here, that's the v1s directive that you can use. Okay, but keep in mind then, children of that element will only also be rendered once. Okay, next subsection here is raw HTML. And then they say this, okay, so the double mustache syntax, right, that we had here. Yeah, let's go back to the p tag, right? Sorry, can't speak. So let's say we have this p tag here, and let's say maybe we have a message variable that we're adding, right? So let me put that on one line actually. So there's a message variable and we're rendering that in a p tag, and of course now we should get nothing, right? Because we don't have a message. But if we go back to the JavaScript, we open up the data model and we add the message property, and we say maybe hello world, this is, let's say, great shopping cart, exclamation point, something like that. Okay, makes no sense, whatever. So then we get that message, of course, but then the question is, yeah, but then what they're saying is that when you're using this sort of double mustache syntax, as we're using here, when we're saying mustache, like opening mustache, message, closing mustache, then that data will be interpreted as plain text and not as HTML. So what that means is that if we go to the main.js file, again back to the data model, and we say maybe we add the bold tag around the word great, and then we actually let me do underline instead, because that's more obvious. And then we refresh. You can see it's sort of escaping all of the elements, or it's escaping syntactically relevant characters, or characters that are part of HTML tags. So it's probably escaping maybe like the slash, or maybe like the tags. Actually, maybe we could actually dive into and look at that. Let's just go inspect element here. It's probably just the tags, I would guess. No, okay, so probably the Chrome inspector thingy thing is probably smart enough to give us to show us this as text. But if I do edit as text here, no, okay, it's actually still smart enough to tell us, or to render this as text. Okay, so I guess it's something like there's a character code. I can't remember what it is, but it's something like an ampersand and maybe a number or whatever. I mean, there's a character code that's used instead of these characters to really make sure that they are not interpreted as HTML, but rather interpreted as strings. But yeah, so yeah, I mean, it's not relevant. You can Google like character code or like escaping tags in HTML. If you want to see what the character codes are that are being used. But anyways, so what they're saying is that, so it's of course not then interpreted as HTML, it's interpreted as plain text. However, you can force Vue to render it as HTML, but then you need to use this VHTML directive. So that means that if we have this message and we have this template, then I can't use the mustache syntax. Instead, I need to bind on the p tag. I need to use vbind, and I need to bind. No, sorry, not vbind. I need to use vhtml. I need to use the directive HTML and say raw HTML, right? Sorry, that was extremely silly of me. I was just looking at what they were doing. I don't say raw HTML, of course. I say message, because my variable is message, right? So we're adding this p tag, and then we're saying add the v directive vhtml. So add the attribute vhtml and set that to be the value message. So bind this p tag to the data model property message, but through the directive HTML, which means that it will be interpreted as HTML and not just as a plain string. And of course, if we then update this page, you can see now we actually get an underlined text here where it says great in the sentence great shopping cart. So that's cool, right? And of course, now I use the mustache syntax, but I guess, is the directive called bind otherwise? Is that true? No. Sorry, let me just jump back. Can we... I'm just forgetting, right? Let's... sorry, let me go back one section here. Let's figure this out. So we are ensuring that we're learning, right? It's like... can I... watch data la la la. No, but this is all other stuff. Let's go to the introduction. Sorry, one of the cats need to get in. Creating an introduction. Yeah, okay, sorry, let me just let the cat in. Okay, sorry about that. So let's just see, we're back on the first page here, right? So you can use the mustache syntax, and then you can, yeah, okay, sorry, with vbind we have to bind to something. Yeah, okay, we have to bind to something else. We have to bind to, for example, titles. I was thinking, is it possible to bind to the value in, or like the mixed content inside of an element? Because if it was, I would just be interested in seeing like switching back and forth between that vbind and then that vhtml, because they are more alike. But I mean, anyways, that doesn't really matter. If you don't want to render HTML, you use this mustache syntax that you can use to interpolate inside, interpolate in the mixed content inside an element of, inside an HTML element, inside the contents of an HTML element. Let's just jump back here to the correct, whoops, sorry, wrong section, to the correct section, or like to the section that we were in the documentation, so we don't get lost. So template syntax, and we were talking about interpolations, right? So this is where we were. So you do it this way. You use this mustache syntax if you don't want to render HTML, and then you just get that as plain text. But if you want to render HTML, then you have to use this VHTML directive and sort of add it. You move it up one level instead of like specifying it inside an element, you specify it as an attribute on the opening tag of that element. So it's a directive VHTML, and then you just set that to the name of your variable. And then, of course, then you get rendered HTML. Now, of course, what they're saying here, and I think this is very important, is that they are saying, oh, sorry, I was in the wrong place. We were at interpolation, but here in the documentation, raw HTML, right? And they're just showing an example as well of how this works. And then they are saying here, let me just read this warning that they're specifying here, right? Because it's important. So they're saying dynamically rendering arbitrary HTML on your website can be very dangerous because it can easily lead to cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, XSS vulnerabilities. Only use HTML interpolation on trusted content and never on user-provided content, right? So if the content stems, so if the yeah, but this is actually, I would say this is a bit tricky, right? Because now you're also on the client side. So I'm not a big security guy, so I should not dive into this in too much details. But like, I would be concerned to use this like at all, right? So let's just, I mean, cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. Let's just, if you click this link, you end up on the Wikipedia page, right? And if you intend to use, for example, this VHTML directive, I would say it's really important to get really familiarized with this thing, right? Let's just like read 2 sentences or something like that. It's like XSS is a type of computer security vulnerability typically found in web applications. It enables attackers to inject client-side scripts into web pages viewed by other users. So a cross-site scripting vulnerability may be used by attackers to bypass access controls, such as the same origin policy or whatever. Okay, so like think about this scenario. What if there's this, like this is a really contrived example, but what if there's this fruit text box here, right? And what if when I'm rendering the items, I'm not actually just rendering, actually let's do that, right? So let's say this. So if I add another input field and another button, let's say, and then I bind this first input field to the message property. Yeah, sorry, and then I don't need another button because we have that message property, right? So then you can see here in the first text field, let me just put that inside of a div so that we get line breaks. Div, whoops, whoop. Oh my lord. Okay, save that, refresh. Okay, so then you can see we have, maybe put those in the same location so this doesn't feel very strange, like that. Okay, so then you can see we have this text field here, and then this following p tag or this p tag that follows that, right? Maybe actually let me just make this a span tag instead, so it's on the same line. Okay, so there's this text field, input field, and then there's this resulting text that comes out. And notice how this U element is part of the input field. But if I now remove this U element, you can see suddenly this isn't valid HTML. I remove the U from the opening tag. So now we just get the 2 tags out. So it's really interpreting it as HTML. It's like if I would add a P tag here, like hello world, close the P tag. I don't know, it's like maybe span. How did they change color, right? Let's look at that. It's like this is some old style color red. Okay. So I mean, they're just adding some style, some CSS on the attribute, right? So color :red. Maybe close that span, right? Actually, maybe let's not close that span. Can I? Let's think about this. I'm rendering the HTML. No, but I'm rendering the HTML inside of this span, so I can't. But if I remove, okay, so let me do this. If I remove from our template those div tags, so we just have the input field and then we have the span tag. So I'm trying to cause sort of problems for myself. So let me just use the sort of br tag instead, so to break between these visually. Okay, so now if I would say hello world, right? It's just some normal text. But if I add a span tag now, for example, and then say style color colon red, close that. Hello. No, okay. So it's somehow. Yeah, of course. Sorry, it's my bad, of course, because as I was hoping that maybe I could make the rest of the text red as well, but of course I can't because I'm just changing the style of this particular element and not of the coming elements. But anyways, I mean, this doesn't really matter. I mean, the point that I'm trying to make is that if the contents of this box, for example, would be saved into a database and then loaded into the web page of other users, then I could do some really crazy things, such as, for example, making the web page look exactly like the user expects it to look, but somehow sort of performing some, like helping the user perform malicious operations toward themselves, right? So to like somehow making them send data to me, or like rendering, like inserting an iframe that renders some content from a completely different page, or crazy stuff like this, right? And just to sort of let's just try one more thing. If we have like, let's say I have a div and then I say style and then we do something like position absolute and then let's say top 0, bottom 0, left 0, right 0, and then background color red. What's that? A div, and then I close this, and then I close the div. Yeah, there we go, right? So what I've done now is I've just added sort of a div that overlays the whole page, that covers the whole page, and has the color red, right? I mean, so this is like, it's completely harmless, obviously, but the point is that this gives this sort of visual. This is I think is a prime example of how you could, whatever is underneath, you could just hide that from the user, and then just add whatever craziness you want to add here. And of course, if you do it, what is that like? Not carefully, but with not with class, but you can see what I mean. It's like you do it with some grace, then you could make the user believe that they were on the site that they usually are, but then you help them give you data or whatever, right? So it's like there's some serious hacking problems, like some serious hacking problems that can be caused. I mean, cross-site scripting is a serious problem, right? So don't take don't accept HTML from a user, and don't render HTML, right? Like if you have really controlled scenarios, then something like this might be a good idea, like or using the VHTML might be a good idea. Or if you really think about what you're doing and you are making sure that what you're doing is safe, then no problem, right? But just be aware. Okay, are we going one more section? What did we say? We were at. Yeah, okay, we are still at interpolations, right? So we've talked about raw HTML. We're going to talk about attributes and using JavaScript expressions. Actually, I think we're going to cut here, and then we're going to do that in the next one. So attributes, so binding attributes to things in your data model, and then using JavaScript expressions in your interpolations within your templates. That's what we're going to talk about next time. Anyways, I hope this was useful. Thanks a ton for watching. Glad to have you along in this series. Shoot any comments that you might have in the comments, and hit the like button if you appreciate it. Remember to subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.